My wife confessed she'd been having an affair with my younger brother when she told me the baby she was carrying wasn't mine. For 30 years, I'd been the family scapegoat, while David was the golden child who could do no wrong. When I got straight A's, our parents said I was showing off. When David failed his classes, they hired him tutors and blamed the teachers. When I graduated college with honors, they attended David's high school graduation party instead. When he dropped out of community college, they gave him a car and said he needed time to find himself. I thought marriage would finally give me something that was truly mine. Karen and I had been together for 3 years, and for once in my life, I felt like I had a family member who actually chose me first. But even then, David couldn't let me have anything. He'd show up at our house uninvited, interrupt our date nights, and make inappropriate comments about Karen right in front of me. When I complained to our parents, Mom would say, "He's just being friendly. You're too sensitive." Dad would add, "David's young and still learning boundaries. Cut him some slack." I should have seen it coming. David had always taken everything that was mine, from toys to achievements to parental attention. My wife was carrying my brother's child. Growing up, I learned that being responsible meant being invisible. When I did well, it was expected. When I struggled, I was told to figure it out myself. Meanwhile, David's every breath was celebrated like a miracle. I maintained a 4.0 GPA throughout high school, while working part-time to pay for my own clothes and supplies. David barely passed his classes, but our parents spent hundreds on tutoring and blamed his teachers for not understanding his learning style. When I earned a full academic scholarship to college, Dad's only comment was, "Well, someone had to be the bookworm." When David got rejected from the same university, they threw him a consolation party and promised him a car if he'd just try community college. The pattern continued into adulthood. I worked my way through college debt-free and landed a solid job in accounting. David dropped out after 1 semester, spent 2 years finding himself, then moved back home where Mom did his laundry and Dad paid his credit card bills. At family gatherings, they'd brag about David's artistic temperament and entrepreneurial spirit while introducing me as our other son who does taxes. I was the problem child who never caused problems. David seemed to genuinely believe that everything good in life should naturally flow to him. When I got promoted at work, he asked why I needed more money since I was already boring. When I bought my first house, he suggested I should let him live in the guest room since he was between places, which really meant between our parents finally setting boundaries and his next failure. But the worst part was how he treated my relationships. In college, he'd show up drunk at parties where my girlfriend and I were hanging out, making inappropriate comments and trying to get her attention. When I brought dates home for family dinners, he'd monopolize the conversation with stories about his latest adventures. My parents thought it was hilarious. "David's just so charismatic," Mom would say. "He can't help it if people are drawn to him." David believed he deserved everything I had. When I met Karen at a work conference, I thought I'd finally found something he couldn't touch. She was smart, independent, and lived 3 states away from my family's dysfunction. We dated long distance for a year before she moved closer, and for once I felt like I had someone who saw me first. But even then, David couldn't let me have peace. At our wedding, he showed up 15 minutes late and made a toast about how lucky Karen was to settle down with someone stable, while he remained free to chase his dreams. During our first year of marriage, he'd drop by unannounced always when Karen was home alone, always with some excuse about needing to borrow something or just wanting to catch up with his new sister-in-law. David always took what was mine. When Karen told me she was pregnant 6 months into our marriage, I should have been over the moon. We'd talked about starting a family eventually, but the timing felt off. The math was strange. She was already 12 weeks along, but we'd only been trying for a month. When I mentioned the discrepancy, she got defensive and snapped that stress can affect these things. But it wasn't just the timing that bothered me. Karen had been acting differently for weeks before the announcement. She'd become secretive about her phone taking calls in the other room and quickly closing texts when I walked by. She started working late more often. Claimed she was too tired for our usual dinner dates and seemed distant during conversations. Most troubling was David's behavior. He'd always been inappropriate around Karen, but lately he'd become almost protective. He'd call our house to check on her when he knew I was at work. He brought her flowers after her doctor appointments I didn't even know about until he mentioned them. When I asked Karen how David knew about her medical schedule, she said he was just being a thoughtful brother-in-law. Something didn't feel right about the timing. 3 weeks later, Karen broke down completely. I came home from work to find her sobbing at the kitchen table surrounded by crumpled tissues. She looked up at me with red, swollen eyes and said, "I need to tell you something and you're going to hate me." My stomach dropped before she even said the words. "I've been having an affair," she whispered, "with David for 6 months. The baby might not be yours." The world stopped. 6 months. The entire duration of our marriage, she'd been sleeping with my brother. While I was working overtime to save for our future, while I was telling my parents how happy I was, while I was planning to be a father, my wife and my brother had been betraying me behind my back. She told me everything through tears. The first few days after Karen's confession were a blur of disbelief and rage. I kept replaying every moment of our marriage, looking for signs I'd missed. The business trips David took that coincidentally aligned with my overtime shifts. The way Karen would mention running into him at the grocery store, at the coffee shop, at places that made no sense given where he lived. The flowers that appeared in our house that she claimed were just because gifts from her coworkers. It wasn't just the affair that destroyed me. It was the calculated nature of it. They'd planned around my schedule. They'd used my trust and my work ethic against me. While I was putting in extra hours to build our future, they were building their secret relationship. While I was excited about becoming a father, my wife was carrying my brother's child. The family implications hit me like a freight train. This wasn't just my marriage ending, it was my entire family structure exploding. My wife and brother had destroyed everything. But what stunned me even more was David's reaction when he found out Karen had confessed. Instead of remorse, shame, or even basic acknowledgement of what he'd done, he seemed genuinely annoyed that their secret was out. He showed up at our house 2 days later, like he was coming to mediate a minor disagreement. "Look, man, these things happen," he said, making himself comfortable on our couch. "Karen and I have a real connection. We didn't plan it, but we're not going to apologize for following our hearts." When I told him he needed to leave and never contact us again, he actually laughed. "You're being dramatic. This doesn't have to change anything between us as brothers. We've gotten through worse." The dismissive behavior was exactly what I should have expected. David had spent 30 years taking my achievements, my opportunities, and my relationships without consequence. Now he'd taken my wife and the child I thought was mine, and he genuinely believed this would blow over, like all his previous boundary violations. He kept showing up at our house uninvited, calling Karen to check on her, and even had the audacity to suggest we could work something out where he remained involved in the baby's life. He thought Mom and Dad would protect him, and unfortunately, he was absolutely right. When Karen finally told my parents about the affair, her sanitized version that painted them as tragic star-crossed lovers who couldn't fight their feelings, their immediate concern wasn't my devastation or the destruction of my marriage. It was damage control for David. Mom called within hours. "Honey, I know you're hurt, but these situations are very complicated. Karen says you've been working too much and not giving her the attention she needed. Maybe this is a wake-up call about priorities in marriage." Dad was even more direct. David is beside himself with guilt. He never meant for this to happen. The last thing he needs right now is you making this situation worse for everyone. You need to be the bigger person and think about what's best for the family. The bigger person. After 30 years of absorbing David's failures and their excuses, they wanted me to be understanding about my wife's affair with their golden child. They assumed I'd stay quiet like always, while my family expected me to just absorb this betrayal like I'd absorbed everything else. Something inside me had shifted. Instead of collapsing into self-pity, I became coldly methodical. If they wanted to treat me like the family scapegoat one more time, I was going to make sure everyone knew exactly what they were covering up. I started documenting everything. I recorded Karen's detailed confession about the timeline of her affair, where they met, how often they were together, and how they coordinated around my work schedule. I documented the pregnancy timing and David's suspicious behavior over the past 6 months. Most importantly, I planned how to get David to admit everything himself on record, in front of witnesses who couldn't dismiss or minimize what they heard. I needed proof they couldn't deny. Meanwhile, David continued acting like he was the victim in this situation. He kept showing up at our house not to apologize or show remorse, but to complain about how complicated things had become. He'd sit in our living room and talk about his feelings for Karen, about how guilty he felt for hurting me, and about how we needed to figure out a solution that works for everyone. "I know this is hard for you," he said during one of his uninvited visits. "But Karen and I really care about each other. We can't just turn our feelings off. Maybe we could work out some kind of arrangement where we all stay involved in the baby's life." An arrangement. He wanted me to help raise my brother's child while he continued his relationship with my wife. He acted like nothing had changed. Karen, for her part, was desperately trying to convince me that the affair meant nothing. She'd cry and apologize, then in the same breath suggest that maybe this was meant to happen, because she and David had such a deep connection. She tried emotional manipulation, promising to cut off all contact with David if I'd just give her another chance. She tried practical manipulation, reminding me about our mortgage and shared finances, and how complicated a divorce would be. "I made a mistake," she'd say through tears, "but destroying our marriage isn't going to fix anything. We can get through this if you just try to understand." When that didn't work, she brought in reinforcements. My mother started calling daily, suggesting couples counseling, and talking about how precious marriage was, and how I needed to fight for love. She begged me to forgive and forget, but I was done fighting for people who had never fought for me. Instead, I focused on my strategy. I knew my parents would never believe how bad David's behavior really was unless they heard it directly from him. I knew they'd make excuses and blame me for driving Karen away unless they had undeniable evidence. So I planned a family's dinner. I called my parents and suggested we all get together to work things out like adults. I told them Karen and I wanted to discuss the situation openly and get their guidance on how to move forward. They were thrilled. Finally, their responsible son was asking for help instead of causing drama. I decided to let David confess himself. During her breakdown, Karen had given me far more evidence than she realized. In her guilt and desperation to confess, she'd provided specific dates, locations, and details about every aspect of their affair. When I asked her to clarify certain points, she answered honestly, thinking that transparency would somehow help our marriage. My wife confessed to 6 months of secret meetings with David starting just 2 weeks after our wedding. She told me about the hotel rooms they'd rented using David's credit card, the restaurants where they'd meet for lunch dates while I was at work, and even the coffee shop where David had first told her he had feelings for her. She described how they'd coordinate their schedules around mine, how David would text her when he saw my car leaving for work, and how they'd developed code words for their meetups. The detail was devastating, but invaluable. She'd kept every text message because she didn't want to forget anything about their connection. She'd saved receipts from their dates because she was worried about spending money without me knowing where it went. In trying to manage her guilt, she'd documented her own betrayal. Karen had documented every betrayal, but the most damning evidence came from correlating the timeline with Karen's pregnancy. When I laid out all the dates she'd given me, the pattern became undeniable. The baby was conceived during a week when Karen and David had spent 3 consecutive afternoons together while I was working overtime on a client audit. Karen had even mentioned that particular week because it was when she'd started feeling different about David, more emotionally connected. The pregnancy symptoms had started exactly 2 weeks after that intensive period of their affair, which aligned perfectly with conception timing. Meanwhile, during that same period, Karen had been distant with me, claiming she was stressed about work and needed space. We'd barely been intimate for the entire month, which made the timeline even clearer. The dates proved everything I suspected. Looking back, their behavioral changes made perfect sense with the affair timeline. David had started calling our house more frequently right after our honeymoon, always asking to speak to Karen about family things. Karen had begun working late exactly when David's supposed freelance projects started keeping him busy during regular hours. She'd started mentioning running into David at random places, the gym, the grocery store, the bank, with a frequency that should have been suspicious. Even their body language at family gatherings had changed. David would position himself near Karen, making inside jokes and sharing glances that seemed innocent at the time, but now revealed their secret relationship. Karen would mention David's opinions on things she'd never cared about before: movies, restaurants, even political topics. She'd started defending David's behavior when I'd complain about his boundary violations, saying he was just being friendly or that I was too sensitive. The most painful realization was how they'd used my own character against me. They knew I worked hard and trusted completely, so they'd built their entire affair around my predictable schedule and my lack of suspicion. David would even ask me about my work projects, not out of brotherly interest, but to know exactly when I'd be out of the house for extended periods. Their behavior changes made perfect sense now. With all this evidence compiled, I needed to ensure that when the truth came out, my parents couldn't dismiss it or make excuses. I set up a simple plan. I would call David while my parents were visiting, put the phone on speaker, and let him confess in his own words. I'd tell him Karen had already told my parents everything and see how he responded. If he was truly remorseless, if he really believed our parents would protect him, no matter what, he'd probably admit to everything, thinking there were no consequences. The family dinner was scheduled for the following Sunday. I'd invited my parents over for what they thought was a reconciliation conversation. I'd positioned myself near the phone with my parents, sitting comfortably in the living room where they could hear everything clearly. I'd even prepared a list of questions that would encourage David to provide details about the affair timeline, just in case he tried to minimize what had happened. Everything was in place. The evidence spoke louder than their favoritism. The family dinner was set for Sunday afternoon at 2 p.m. I'd carefully orchestrated every detail to ensure my parents would hear David's confession directly from his own mouth. I told them I wanted to clear the air and that Karen and I needed their guidance about how to move forward as a family. They were thrilled. Their responsible son was finally asking for help instead of creating drama. I positioned the seating so my parents would be directly facing me when I made the call close enough to hear every word clearly, but far enough that David wouldn't suspect they were listening. I planned to call David at exactly 3 p.m. when I knew he'd be relaxed and off guard after his usual Sunday afternoon workout. I tested the speakerphone volume multiple times, prepared backup questions to encourage details, and even rehearsed my opening lines to sound casual and non-threatening. I positioned Mom and Dad perfectly. Meanwhile, David's arrogance had reached new heights. While I was methodically gathering evidence and planning his downfall, he was becoming increasingly brazen about the affair. He'd started dropping by our house almost daily, acting like he owned the place. He'd bring Karen flowers, sit at our kitchen table, discussing their future plans, and talk openly about how complicated the situation was for him. When I confronted him about his behavior, he'd dismiss my concerns with his usual gaslighting tactics. "You're being paranoid," he'd say. "Karen and I are just trying to figure out what's best for the baby. You should be grateful I'm stepping up to take responsibility." The fact that I'd been gathering detailed evidence of his affair, recording our conversations and documenting his admissions, meant nothing to him. David thought he was untouchable. My parents had approached this dinner with their typical casual attitude toward family drama. Mom had spent the week baking David's favorite cookies to keep things positive, and Dad had prepared his standard lecture about boys will be boys and how I needed to be more understanding of David's emotional growth. They'd already decided this was just another case of me being too sensitive about David's behavior. Mom had even called me twice during the week to remind me to keep an open mind and remember that family forgiveness is a blessing. They'd prepared their usual golden child defense talking points. David was young. He was learning these things happen, and I needed to be the mature, older brother who set a good example by showing grace under pressure. They expected me to complain about David again, but what they couldn't anticipate was that this time, I wasn't coming with complaints or accusations that they could dismiss or minimize. I had David's own recorded admissions, Karen's detailed confessions, and a strategic plan that would force them to hear the truth directly from their golden child's mouth. The phone call was scheduled for 3 p.m. sharp. I'd positioned the recording device, tested the speaker volume one final time, and prepared my opening statement to David about how Karen had told Mom and Dad everything, to see how he'd react. The beauty of the plan was its simplicity. David's overconfidence would make him careless with his words, and my parents would become unwitting witnesses to his confession. Mom and Dad had no idea what was coming. At exactly 3 p.m. with my parents seated comfortably in the living room after Sunday dinner, I picked up the phone and dialed David's number. Mom and Dad were still talking about how mature I was being by wanting to work things out as a family. They had no idea they were about to become witnesses to the most devastating confession in our family's history. "Hey, David," I said when he answered, making sure to keep my voice casual. "Listen, I need to talk to you about something. Karen ended up telling Mom and Dad everything about you two, and they're pretty upset. I think you should probably call them and explain your side of things." I activated the speakerphone before he could respond. The golden child confessed to his parents on speakerphone, and they heard every single word. I put David on speaker for everyone to hear. David's response was immediate and exactly what I'd expected from someone who'd spent 30 years believing he was untouchable. Instead of denying anything or asking what specifically Karen had told them, he launched straight into justification mode. "Oh, man. I was wondering when this was going to come out," he said, his voice filling our living room. "Look, I know it seems bad, but Karen and I really do have something special. We tried to fight it, but the connection was just too strong. I mean, we've been meeting up for months now, and honestly, the baby is probably mine anyway." My parents' faces went through a series of expressions I'd never seen before. Mom's mouth fell open, and Dad's coffee cup froze halfway to his lips. David kept talking, completely oblivious to his audience. "I know the timing is weird with her being married to you and everything, but these things happen. You know, Karen's been unhappy for a while, and I've been there for her in ways you haven't. The physical stuff just naturally developed from the emotional connection." David admitted everything to our parents. The room fell into shocked silence for what felt like an eternity. Mom was the first to find her voice, but it came out as a strangled whisper. "David, please tell me you're joking. Please tell me this is some kind of sick prank." Mom? It's not a big deal, David replied, still completely missing the gravity of the situation. People fall in love. It happens. You guys always taught me to follow my heart. That's when Mom screamed. Not a startled yelp, but a full-throated scream of horror and rage. Dad's coffee cup crashed to the floor, shattering across the hardwood. You did what? Dad roared. You had an affair with your brother's wife. You destroyed his marriage, and you're talking about it like it's some romantic movie. The denial attempts came next, desperate and pathetic. Maybe Karen was confused about the timeline, Mom whispered, grasping for any explanation that would make this less catastrophic. Maybe the baby really is yours, and David was just helping with emotional support. But David, in his infinite arrogance, destroyed even that last hope. No, Mom, we've definitely been sleeping together, for months. The baby is definitely mine. I mean, look at the timing. She's been distant from him since we started our relationship. Mom screamed, and Dad went completely silent. The protection that had shielded David for 30 years evaporated in an instant. Dad's face went through rage, disgust, and then something I'd never seen before. Complete rejection of his golden child. You're no son of mine, he said, his voice deadly quiet. 30 years I defended you, made excuses for you, gave you every advantage. And this is what you do with it. David, you need to leave this house right now, Mom added, her voice shaking with fury. Don't come back. Don't call. Don't contact us until you figure out how to make this right with your brother. But Mom, you always said family forgives, David started. There's no forgiveness for this, Dad interrupted. There's no coming back from destroying your own brother's life. You want to talk about inheritance, about your future? You just threw it all away. The family favorite became the family disgrace. In the stunned silence that followed, my parents turned to me with expressions I'd never seen before. Respect, sympathy, and something that looked like reverence. Dad reached for his phone immediately. I'm calling my lawyer tomorrow, he said. 30 years of giving him everything while you got nothing. I need to make this right. The will, the family business, everything is going to you. I'm so sorry, Mom added, tears streaming down her face. We should have listened to you. We should have seen what he really was. You tried to tell us for years, and we failed you as parents. For the first time, they chose me over David. 6 weeks after the phone call that destroyed David's life, the DNA test results arrived by certified mail. I'd demanded the paternity test as part of the divorce proceedings, and both David and Karen had been forced to comply by court order. The scientific evidence was crystal clear. David was indeed the biological father of the child Karen was carrying. The document was official, medical, and absolutely undeniable. 99.7% probability of paternity. There was no room for doubt, no possibility of error, no way for anyone to question what had really happened. The test results validated everything Karen had confessed, everything David had admitted, and every suspicion I'd had about the timeline. The DNA test confirmed everything. True to his word, Dad had called his lawyer the very next day after David's confession. Within 2 months, the family will have been completely rewritten. The new document left me nearly $2 million in assets investments, and the family business that David had always assumed would be his. David received exactly $1, a deliberate legal gesture to ensure he couldn't contest the will. But the transformation went beyond just money. My parents' entire support system shifted to me. They started calling weekly to check on my well-being, something they'd never done in 30 years. They began introducing me to their friends as our successful son, instead of our other son. When family members asked about David, they would simply say he was no longer part of our lives and redirect the conversation to my achievements. Dad left David $1 and me. Everything. The divorce was finalized 3 months later. I'd been promoted to senior accountant at my firm, partially because the emotional clarity of cutting toxic people out of my life had improved my work performance dramatically. I moved into a downtown apartment that I chose, and furnished entirely according to my own preferences, without having to consider anyone else's needs or demands. The betrayal that had once felt like it would destroy me had actually given me exactly what I'd needed. Freedom from a toxic marriage validation from my family, and the peace that comes from living authentically, without trying to earn love from people who'd never valued me properly. I learned that betrayal sometimes gives you exactly the freedom you didn't know you needed.